From the moment the world heard that Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 had crashed in a Ukrainian field in July last year, killing everyone on board, two overarching questions remained unanswered. How did it happen, and why? Now only one is outstanding. After a 15-month, 7-nation investigation, we now know how MH17 was forced from the sky.
Flight MH17 crashed because of a 9N314M warhead detonated outside the aeroplane above the left side of the cockpit. This warhead fits the kind of missile that is installed on the Buk surface-to-air missile system. As a result of the warhead's detonation, thousands of small, preformed metal objects were ejected with tremendous force. Several hundreds of them hit the aeroplane. The impact killed the 3 crew members present in the cockpit at that moment and caused structural damage to the forward part of the aeroplane. As a result of the detonation, the forward section of the airplane broke off, after which the airplane broke up in the air. The tail section probably crashed before the center section. This center section, which also contained the engines, hit the ground upside down and caught fire. The breakup resulted in a wreckage area of about 50 square kilometers.
Almost 2/3 of the 298 passengers and crew on the Boeing 777 were Dutch. So it was the Dutch who led the international investigation team. At an Air Force base in the Netherlands, aviation experts spent 3 months painstakingly piecing together on a specially manufactured frame debris gathered from the countryside in an area of eastern Ukraine close to the Russian border near Donetsk. Where at the time of the crash there had been fierce fighting between Ukrainian government forces and separatist militia backed by Moscow. Which brings more questions. Why was the airliner flying over a war zone, and who fired the missile that blew it out of the sky?
61 operators from 32 different countries flew above the area. On the day of the crash, a total of 160 flights had operated above the eastern part of Ukraine until the airspace was closed after the crash. Every single one of those operators thought that it was safe. There was undeniable an armed conflict taking place on the ground, but above 32,000 feet, that is approximately 10 kilometers, the airspace was open to civil aviation. Nobody considered the possibility that civil aircraft at cruising altitude were at risk.
In the early afternoon of July the 17th, 2014, a Boeing 777-200 of Malaysia Airlines departs Amsterdam Airport Schiphol for Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Flight MH17 enters Ukrainian airspace at an altitude of 33,000 feet, following airway Lima 980. The crew diverts a short distance to the north to avoid some thunderstorms when returning to the airway in the eastern part of Ukrainian airspace. In this region, an armed conflict between the Ukrainian government and armed groups is in progress. Therefore, lower levels of the airspace are restricted for civil air traffic. Flight MH17 is routed above this restricted airspace to waypoint Romeo November Delta in the Russian Federation. Until that moment, the flight proceeds normally.
The investigation team even modelled the missile strike itself and the devastating effect it would have had on the superstructure of the aircraft and the doomed passengers and crew inside it.
A Buk surface-to-air missile can reach an altitude of 80,000 feet, exceeding the flight altitude of flight MH17 by far. At 20 minutes and 3 seconds past 1, this warhead explodes to the left and above the cockpit of MH17. About 800 preformed fragments perforate the aeroplane. This impact, combined with the blast of the explosion, causes the cockpit and the business class section to separate. As it descends, the aeroplane disintegrates.
According to the investigators' report, the 3 flight crew in the cockpit died immediately the missile struck.
The high-energy objects that perforated the aeroplane were also found in the bodies of 3 crew members seated in the cockpit. The preformed fragments have distinctive shapes, cubic and bow-tie shaped, and were made of a ferrous metal. Some fragments had traces of aluminium and glass on them, proving that they had perforated the aeroplane from the outside. The 2 left windows of the cockpit particularly show perforation by preformed fragments.
For the others on board MH17, we can only imagine the terror of those who may have survived the initial impact. The investigation team has attempted to apply scientific rigour to those imaginings. They were exposed to extreme and many different interacting factors, they say. Abrupt deceleration and acceleration, decompression and associated mist formation, decrease in oxygen level, extreme cold, strong airflow, the aeroplane's very rapid descent and objects flying around. It was not possible to ascertain at which moment the occupants died. The impact on the ground was not survivable. It's likely that the occupants were barely able to comprehend the situation in which they found themselves. The Dutch report goes out of its way to avoid pointing the finger at those responsible for the targeting of a civilian aircraft. But in the 15 months since MH17 was brought down, there have been repeated and persistent claims that it was a Russian-supplied missile fired by separatists who thought the airliner was a military jet. This amateur video from shortly after the crash apparently shows panicking militiamen rifling through the wreckage and personal effects of the dead as the reality dawns on them that they've shot down a passenger plane. It certainly wasn't the first aircraft they'd attacked in that area last summer.
In the month before the crash, at least 16 military airplanes and helicopters were shot down in the eastern part of Ukraine. The Ukrainian authorities were aware of this. They stated that occasionally weapon systems were used that could reach the cruising altitude of civil airliners. Yet, despite all this, Ukraine did not close its airspace.
Even though Russia was part of the international team of investigators, Moscow has already rubbished the final report, calling it biased. And the Russian arms manufacturer Almaz-Antey, that makes the Buk missiles, disclosed the findings of its own reconstructions and possible scenarios, even before the official Dutch report was published.
The results of our experiments have entirely refuted the conclusions by the Dutch Commission about the type of the rocket and the place of the launch.
Their conclusions: the missile could not have been fired by Russian or separatist forces, but instead came from an area controlled by Ukrainian government troops. The missile itself was an old model, they say, no longer used by the Russians.
I personally have no doubts that it was an operation which was planned by Russian special services to bring down Malaysian Airlines civil plane flight MH17. It was made from territory which was under the control of Russian rebels, and there's no doubt that drunk separatists do not know how to operate Buk systems. It means those systems were operated by professional Russian servicemen only.
Despite the denials, there is an ongoing criminal investigation into the attack on MH17. And prosecutors now say they've identified what they call persons of interest, though they haven't said who they are or where they are. They have, though, let it be known that their inquiries which were expected to be concluded by the end of this year, will now drag on into 2016. For the families of those who perished on the Malaysia Airlines flight, there is some comfort in knowing finally what happened to their loved ones, and that they're unlikely to have suffered for long. But they are still, for now, denied a definitive answer to who murdered them at 33,000 feet.